There are places in this world where the veil between realms grows thin. Ancient canyons carved by time and water, where whispers echo through stone corridors that have witnessed millennia of secrets. Places where silence speaks louder than words. What happens when a child who has lost her voice meets a creature that can never speak? When grief is too heavy for human shoulders, sometimes the wild offers a different kind of language, a connection that transcends the barriers we build around our broken hearts. In the depths of the Grand Canyon, where shadows dance across crimson walls and legends breathe alongside reality, a young girl stands at the crossroads of two worlds. Her mother vanished here 1 year ago. Something else waits for her now. Some call it myth, others miracle. But in the space between science and faith, between the seen and unseen, there exists a truth that can only be discovered by those brave enough to listen. The last light of day painted the Grand Canyon in shades of crimson and gold, casting long shadows across the ancient rock faces. The distant echo of a horse's neigh reverberated through the narrow ravine, amplified by the towering walls of stone. Sophie Winters stood frozen, her small 10-year-old frame balanced precariously on a rock in the middle of the rising floodwaters. Her wide eyes scanned the darkening canyon, terror evident in every rapid breath. The water swirled around the stone inch by inch, climbing higher. A movement in the shadows caught her attention. Something was approaching, something large. In the fading light, all she could make out were two reflective eyes watching her from the darkness. Sophie's fingers trembled as they gripped her mother's old film camera. Without thinking, she raised it to her eye, the familiar action a source of comfort in her fear. Through the viewfinder, the shape became clearer for just a moment. She pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated the darkness for a split second, then white. The Winters family RV rumbled down the empty road leading to the Grand Canyon, its aging engine protesting as it climbed the gentle incline. Inside, the atmosphere was as heavy as the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Daniel Winters gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his weathered face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there a year ago. His eyes constantly flicked to the rearview mirror, seeking the daughter he barely recognized anymore. Sophie sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the old film camera in her lap. Her fingers traced the worn leather strap, her mother's strap, with the delicate precision of someone handling a sacred relic. Though the stunning landscape of Arizona's red deserts and distant mesas passed by the window, she refused to look up, locked in her private world of grief. Beside her, Margaret, her grandmother, held open a book about wildlife. The cover showed a magnificent wild Mustang, its mane flowing in the wind. "Look, Sophie," Margaret said gently, her voice carrying the soft lilt of a lifetime spent in libraries and lecture halls. "Did you know Mustangs can run up to 40 miles per hour? Your mother used to love watching them run free when she was your age?" Sophie's expression didn't change. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement crossed her face. Margaret sighed and exchanged a worried glance with Dr. Eliza Reed in the passenger seat. The child psychologist nodded encouragingly, though her eyes revealed her concern. "Give her time," she mouthed silently. From the driver's seat, Daniel's deep voice filled the RV, though he spoke only in his thoughts. "It's been a year since we lost Catherine. A year since my daughter last spoke. This is our last chance." The Grand Canyon campsite bustled with tourists and adventure seekers, a stark contrast to the stillness that had enveloped the Winters family. Their RV stood parked at the edge of the designated area, offering a breathtaking view of the canyon's vastness. Daniel stepped away from the group phone pressed to his ear. His face grew increasingly tense as the conversation continued. "Yes, I understand the offer expires at the end of the month," he said, his voice strained. "But we've just arrived and I need more time to... Yes, I know the Geological Survey Company has been more than patient, but this house belonged to my wife's family for generations. It's not just about the money." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Moving to the city might be what's best for Sophie in the long run, I know that. But I need to be sure." His eyes drifted to where his daughter sat on a nearby rock, still fixated on the camera. "I'll have an answer for you before we leave. That's all I can promise right now." As Daniel ended the call, Margaret approached Sophie and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The girl didn't react, continuing to turn the camera over in her hands with practiced movements. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, noticing the sketchbook open beside Sophie. On the page was a detailed drawing of a black horse rendered with surprising skill for a child her age. What caught Margaret's attention was the distinctive scar running down the animal's hind leg, a white line against the dark coat shaped like a lightning bolt. Something about it seemed hauntingly familiar. With trembling fingers, Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal, Catherine's research notebook. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, a sketch of the same horse with the identical scar labeled Ghost Dancer. Dr. Reed approached Daniel by the RV, her expression serious. "How is she doing today?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that had become habitual in his exhaustion. "The same. Not a word. Not a smile. Just that camera and her drawings." "She's creating an imaginary protector," Dr. Reed explained gently. "It's not uncommon after trauma. Children sometimes invent someone or something that makes them feel safe when their world has been turned upside down." "A black horse," Daniel said. "Always the same one." "It's a connection to Catherine," Dr. Reed replied. "Your wife studied wild Mustangs here in the canyon, didn't she?" Daniel nodded, his eyes drifting to the horizon where the canyon stretched endlessly. "She knew every herd in the area, spent her life documenting them, fighting to protect them. And then," his voice trailed off. The unspoken words hung between them, and then she vanished. That evening, as Sophie slept in the RV, Daniel sat outside under the stars, Catherine's journal open in his lap. He had read it countless times over the past year, searching for answers, for some hint of what had happened that day. The final entry still made no sense to him. April 16th. "I've seen it with my own eyes now. The black Mustang with the lightning scar. The locals were right. There's something different about this one. When I looked into its eyes, I felt like I was looking at something ancient, something that understood me. I've looked into the eyes of an old god, and I know what I must do." The rest of the page was blank. The next day, Catherine had gone missing while hiking alone in a remote part of the canyon. Search parties found her backpack and one hiking boot at the edge of a steep drop, but her body was never recovered. The official report listed her as a victim of a flash flood and falling accident. Daniel closed the journal, unable to bear reading it again. The wound was still too raw, the questions too painful. A gruff voice interrupted his thoughts. "You must be the Winters." Daniel looked up to see an older man standing nearby, his weathered face marked by decades under the harsh desert sun. His silver hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and despite the late hour, he wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his features. "Jack Reynolds," the man introduced himself. "Park guide, native liaison. I knew your wife." Daniel stood, extending his hand. "Daniel Winters. Catherine mentioned you in her journals." Jack nodded, his dark eyes scanning the campsite. "She was a good woman. Respected the land, respected the stories." His gaze settled on the RV where Sophie slept. "That's her daughter." "Sophie," Daniel confirmed. "She's having a difficult time." Jack's expression softened. "I heard she hasn't spoken since it happened." "How did you know that?" Daniel asked, suddenly suspicious. "Small community. Word travels." Jack removed his hat, revealing more of his Navajo features. "I'm here because I promised Catherine I'd tell you about Ghost Dancer if anything ever happened to her." "The black horse she was tracking?" Jack nodded, his expression grave. "The only wild black Mustang that wasn't captured during the roundup 50 years ago. The native people believe it's the embodiment of the canyon spirit, a guide for lost souls." Daniel sighed, his scientific mind struggling with the supernatural implications. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't see how old legends will help my daughter right now." "Perhaps not," Jack acknowledged, "but my sister went missing in these canyons 30 years ago. Found 3 days later in a place searchers had already checked twice. She couldn't explain how she got there, but she kept drawing the same thing your daughter draws, a black horse with a lightning scar. Unreal." From the edge of the conversation, Margaret's voice interrupted, stronger than Daniel had heard it in months. "The Ghost Dancer isn't just any legend." Both men turned to find Margaret standing behind them, Catherine's notebook clutched to her chest. "You know about this?" Daniel asked, surprised. Margaret nodded slowly. "Before I became a literature professor, I was an anthropologist. I studied Navajo myths for years. The ghost dancer was part of my research, a spirit animal that bridges worlds appearing to those caught between life and death. Her voice faltered. I abandoned that research after we lost Jenny. Jenny? Jack inquired. Catherine's older sister, Daniel explained quietly. She died when Catherine was just a child. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I stopped believing in anything I couldn't see or touch after that. Science seems safer than faith. She looked down at the notebook. Catherine found my old research notes in the attic when she was a teenager. She became obsessed with the legend. And now Sophie is drawing the exact same horse. From inside the RV came a sound slight but unmistakable. The door had opened a crack, and through it they could see Sophie's eye peering out, watching them intently. For the first time since their arrival, her attention was focused on something other than the camera. It was the first spark of interest they'd seen in a year. The following morning, the family stood at one of the canyon's scenic overlooks. Tourists milled around them, snapping photos and pointing at the breathtaking views. Daniel held his phone up, trying to coax a smile from Sophie. Just one picture, sweetheart. For Dad. Sophie turned away, raising her mother's camera instead to photograph the distant canyon walls. Something in the way she held the camera with precision and purpose reminded Daniel so powerfully of Catherine that his breath caught in his throat. Dr. Reed placed a gentle hand on his arm. Let her explore in her own way. This is progress, Daniel. She's engaging with her surroundings. Sophie wandered a few feet away, her camera pointed toward the ground now. Daniel watched as she crouched down, examining something on the dirt path. He started to follow, but Dr. Reed held him back. Give her space, she advised. Stay close enough to see her, but let her discover on her own. Sophie had found something, a strange mark in the soil that caught her attention. A hoof print larger and deeper than those left by the mules that carried tourists down the canyon trails. She touched it gently, then followed the direction it pointed, moving away from the crowded lookout. The path curved around a cluster of juniper trees, taking her out of sight from her family, but still within the safe boundaries of the marked trail. Sophie stopped suddenly, her breath catching in her throat. There, caught on a thorny bush, was a small scrap of fabric. Even faded by sun and weather, she recognized it instantly, the distinctive pattern from her mother's favorite hiking jacket, the one she had been wearing the day she disappeared. Sophie reached for it with trembling fingers. As she did, a sensation washed over her, the feeling of being watched. She turned slowly, scanning the rocky landscape. In the distance between two large boulders, something moved, a dark shape too quick to identify. Without hesitation, Sophie raised her camera and captured the image. The click of the shutter echoed in the quiet air, and for a brief, impossible moment, she thought she heard someone calling her name. Her mother's voice carried on the wind. Sophie. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the canyon, unusual for the season. Jack Reynolds had suggested exploring a narrow side canyon that few tourists knew about, a place where he hinted Catherine had spent much of her time. Are you sure this is wise? Margaret asked as they gathered their hiking gear. The weather doesn't look promising. It's just a passing shower, Jack assured her. Besides, these slot canyons are where the wild Mustangs often seek shelter. If Sophie's interested in them, this might help her connect. Margaret pulled Dr. Reed aside as the others prepared. This is where Catherine went missing, she whispered urgently. This exact canyon. I recognized it from the photos in the police report. Dr. Reed's professional demeanor faltered. Why would Jack bring us here then? I don't know, Margaret admitted, but something about this doesn't feel right. As they ventured deeper into the narrow canyon, the walls rose higher on either side, blocking out much of the daylight. Sophie walked ahead with Jack, her camera constantly raised to capture the dramatic rock formations. Daniel followed close behind while Margaret and Dr. Reed brought up the rear, both watching the darkening sky with concern. The first drops of rain were light, barely noticeable on their skin. Then, without warning, the sky opened up. Water poured down in sheets, instantly soaking them to the bone. We need to get to higher ground, Jack shouted over the sudden roar of the storm. Flash floods can come without warning in these canyons. As if summoned by his words, a distant rumble reached their ear, the sound of water rushing through the narrow passages. There! Daniel pointed to a ledge several feet up the canyon wall. We can climb up there. They scrambled toward it as the first surge of water rounded the bend behind them. Jack reached the ledge first, helping Margaret and Dr. Reed up. Daniel turned to lift Sophie, but she had moved further ahead, crossing a narrow makeshift bridge of fallen logs that spanned a gap in the path. "Sophie, come back!" Daniel called out. The water hit the log bridge with terrifying force. Sophie froze in the middle, her small body trembling as the wood beneath her feet began to shift. "Sophie!" Daniel screamed, lunging toward her. Too late. The bridge collapsed, taking Sophie with it. She disappeared into the churning water with a splash that was swallowed by the roar of the flood. Daniel's anguished cry echoed through the canyon as he tried to follow, only to be held back by Jack's strong grip. "You can't help her if you're dead," the guide shouted. "There's another path. We can cut her off downstream." Downstream, Sophie had been swept into a narrow side channel and deposited on a muddy bank. Stunned and coughing up water, she lay still for several moments, clutching her mother's camera to her chest. Somehow she had managed to keep hold of it through everything. As her vision cleared, she realized she was alone in a part of the canyon she didn't recognize. The floodwaters continued to rise around her, forcing her to scramble higher onto a rocky shelf. In the gathering darkness, something moved. Sophie squinted, her heart pounding in her chest. Two eyes reflected what little light remained, eyes that seemed to glow with an inner fire of their own. A hoof print appeared in the mud beside her, pressed fresh before her. Very eyes, though she had seen nothing approach. For the first time in a year, Sophie broke her silence. Her voice emerged as a whisper, rusty from disuse but filled with wonder and hope. "Mom." Daniel raced along the upper path, his heart hammering in his chest. Jack led the way, moving with surprising agility for his age, while Margaret and Dr. Reed struggled to keep up. "The canyon forks up ahead," Jack called back. "If she's washed downstream, she'll end up in the eastern channel." "How can you be sure?" Daniel demanded, panic making his voice harsh. "I know these canyons like the back of my hand," Jack replied grimly. "And I know how the water flows when the rains come." They reached a ridge overlooking the lower canyon just as darkness fell completely. Daniel switched on his flashlight, sweeping its beam across the swollen stream below. "Sophie!" he called, his voice breaking. "Sophie, can you hear me?" Only the echo of his own desperate cry answered him. Sophie huddled against the cold stone wall, her clothes soaked and her ankle throbbing with pain. She had tried to climb higher away from the rising water, but a wrong step had sent her tumbling back down, twisting her ankle in the process. The darkness was absolute now, with only occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the canyon in brief ghostly bursts. During one such flash, she saw it clearly for the first time, a large black horse standing at the edge of the floodwaters, watching her with intelligent eyes. Its coat was as dark as the night around them, but a distinctive white scar ran down its hind leg, exactly like the one in her drawings. Sophie stared transfixed. She had been drawing this horse for months, yet she had never seen it before tonight. How could she have known what it looked like? The horse pawed at the ground, then turned and walked a few steps away before looking back at her as if expecting her to follow. "I can't," Sophie whispered, her voice stronger now with repeated use. "My ankle hurts." The horse whinnied softly, then approached the water's edge. With graceful movements, it began to drink, then looked back at Sophie again. Understanding dawned. Sophie dragged herself to the water's edge and cupped her hands, drinking the fresh rainwater. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat, giving her renewed strength. "Thank you," she said. The horse shadow, she decided to call it, watched her with what seemed like approval. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness. Sophie clutched her mother's camera tighter. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, but her words were lost in the sound of the rain. She was alone again, a small figure in an ancient landscape with only the rising waters and the distant calls of her father to keep her company. The camera in her hands gave a familiar comfort. Sophie raised it to her eye, a habit formed through months of silent observation. Through the viewfinder, the darkness seemed less absolute, the canyon less frightening. She pressed the shutter, capturing nothing but blackness and the memory of what she had seen. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, a sound that echoed through the canyon like a promise. Sophie lowered the camera and whispered into the night, "I'll find you." As dawn broke over the Grand Canyon, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Water still flowed through the lower channels, but the violent flood had receded, leaving muddy banks and debris in its wake. Search and rescue teams had arrived during the night, but darkness and dangerous conditions had prevented a full-scale operation. Now, with the first light helicopters circled overhead, while ground teams spread out along the canyon floor. Daniel hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild as he paced the command post, stopping every few minutes to scan the canyon with binoculars. "We should have found her by now," he said, his voice hoarse from calling Sophie's name all night. "She's just a little girl. She couldn't have gone far." The search coordinator, a ranger named Martinez, approached with a grim expression. "Mr. Winters, I need to be honest with you. The conditions last night were extremely dangerous. The water moved through these canyons with tremendous force." "No," Daniel cut him off. "Don't say it. She's alive. I know she is." "We'll keep searching," Martinez assured him. "But you need to prepare yourself." "For what?" Daniel demanded. "To lose my daughter the same way I lost my wife, in the same canyon." His voice broke. "I can't. I won't." He turned away, unable to continue the conversation. His eyes fell on Catherine's laptop, which he had brought along in case Sophie wanted to look at her mother's research. On impulse, he opened it and began searching through the files. Most were academic research papers, field notes, data on Mustang migration patterns. But one folder caught his attention. Davis Corporation, Confidential. Inside were documents about a major geological survey company, the same one that had been pressuring him to sell their family home. Catherine had been investigating them before her disappearance, compiling evidence of illegal activities on protected land. The most recent file was dated the day before she went missing, a draft email to the Park Service detailing evidence of poaching operations targeting wild Mustangs in restricted areas of the canyon. Daniel stared at the screen, a cold realization washing over him. Catherine's disappearance might not have been an accident after all. A commotion outside pulled him from his thoughts. Jack had returned from scouting one of the lower trails, and he wasn't alone. He was arguing intensely with another man, someone Daniel recognized as Thomas Davis, CEO of the Geological Survey Company, and his wife's former colleague. "What are you doing here?" Daniel demanded as he approached them. Davis turned his expression, carefully composed, into one of concern. "Daniel, I came as soon as I heard about Sophie." "This is terrible." First Catherine, now this. How did you even know we were here?" Daniel asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "The company has been trying to reach you," Davis replied smoothly. "When they couldn't, they called me knowing we were old friends. I was already in Phoenix for a conference, so I drove up to help with the search." Jack stood silently, his dark eyes fixed on Davis with unmistakable hostility. "That's very considerate of you," Daniel said slowly, his mind racing to connect the pieces. "But we have professional search teams handling this." "Of course," Davis nodded. "I just thought, given my familiarity with the area from our survey work, I might be able to offer some insights." He glanced at his watch. "I should check in with my team. We have men volunteering for the search as well." As Davis walked away, Jack stepped closer to Daniel. "Don't trust him," he whispered. "He's not here to help." "What do you know about this?" Daniel demanded. Jack hesitated, then made a decision. "Not here." "Not? Meet me at my truck in 5 minutes. If you want to find your daughter, we need to go now, just the two of us." When Sophie awoke, the first rays of sunlight were filtering into the canyon, illuminating the red rocks in a warm glow. She had spent the night huddled on her rocky shelf, shivering in her damp clothes, drifting in and out of fitful sleep. Her ankle throbbed with pain, but the swelling had gone down slightly. Testing it carefully, she found she could put some weight on it, though walking would be difficult. The floodwaters had receded, leaving a muddy path along the canyon floor. Sophie climbed down carefully from her shelter, wincing with each step. She needed to find her way back, but the canyon looked different in daylight, unfamiliar and vast. A sound caught her attention, the soft nickering of a horse. Turning, she saw Shadow standing a short distance away, watching her with those same intelligent eyes. In the morning light, she could see it clearly, a magnificent black Mustang, powerful and wild, with a distinctive lightning-shaped scar running down its hind leg. "You came back," Sophie said, her voice stronger now. The horse approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. It lowered its head, sniffing the air between them, then turned and began walking slowly along the canyon floor, pausing to look back at her. Sophie understood. Limping painfully, she followed the horse deeper into the canyon. As they traveled, Sophie noticed Shadow was favoring one of its front legs. Looking closer, she saw the horse had been injured. A cactus spine was embedded in its hoof, causing it to limp slightly with each step. "You're hurt too," she said. Shadow stopped watching as Sophie approached slowly. The horse remained still, though its muscles trembled, with the natural instinct to flee from humans. Sophie remembered her mother's teachings about approaching wild animals. Slow movements, calm energy, respect for their space. She spoke softly as she moved closer, her voice gentle and reassuring. "It's okay. I won't hurt you. I just want to help." Reaching the horse, she knelt carefully and examined the injured hoof. The spine was deeply embedded, but she could see it clearly. With steady hands that had watched her mother treat injured wildlife countless times, she grasped the spine and pulled it free in one swift motion. Shadow flinched but didn't pull away. Instead, it lowered its head to Sophie's level, warm breath brushing against her face. For a moment, they remained like that, eyes locked in a connection that transcended words. In that moment, Sophie felt something she hadn't experienced since losing her mother, a sense of being understood, of not being alone. "Who are you?" she whispered. Shadow merely blinked, then turned to continue their journey, its gait noticeably improved. As they walked, Sophie began to talk hesitantly at first, then with increasing fluency as the words she had held inside for a year finally found release. "I miss her so much," she confessed to the horse. "Mom knew everything about horses like you. She would have loved to meet you." Her voice caught. "Sometimes I pretend she's just away on a research trip, that she'll come home with new pictures and stories." Shadow listened, ears flicking back toward her voice as they walked. "Dad tries to understand, but he doesn't. Grandma, too. They want me to talk, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain. "It feels like if I start talking again, if I move on, I'm leaving Mom behind. Like I'm saying it's okay that she's gone." The horse led her to a small spring bubbling from the canyon wall, stopping so she could drink and rest. As Sophie cupped her hands to catch the cool water, she noticed something carved into the rock nearby, a petroglyph, ancient and weathered, depicting humans and horses together. "Mom showed me pictures of these," Sophie said, touching the carving gently. "She said they tell stories of how horses and humans have always been connected." Sonan. Shadow whinnied softly, then continued along the canyon, leading Sophie deeper into a network of passages she suspected few people had ever explored. Shamanam. Daniel and Jack drove in tense silence along an unmarked dirt road that skirted the canyon's edge. Jack's old pickup truck bounced over the rough terrain, taking them far from the official search areas. "Where exactly are we going?" Daniel finally asked. "There's an old poacher's camp near the eastern rim," Jack explained. "Been abandoned for years. At least it was supposed to be." "What does this have to do with Sophie?" Jack's weathered hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Everything in these canyons is connected, Daniel. Your wife understood that. She was tracking something bigger than just wild horses." They parked the truck in a grove of juniper trees and continued on foot. Jack moved with the silent efficiency of someone accustomed to tracking, his eyes constantly scanning the ground for signs. Daniel followed, increasingly convinced that the guide knew more than he was letting on. After 20 minutes of hiking, Jack held up his hand, signaling Daniel to stop. Ahead, barely visible among the rocks and scrub, was a small campsite recently used, judging by the fresh tire tracks and disturbed soil. "Stay low," Jack whispered. "We don't want to announce ourselves." They crept closer, taking cover behind a large boulder. The camp appeared empty, but signs of recent activity were everywhere. A fire pit with warm ashes, empty food containers, equipment cases. "Poachers?" Daniel asked. Jack nodded grimly. "And not just any poachers. These are professionals. Look at that gear, specialized tranquilizer guns, tracking equipment. They're not here for deer or bighorn sheep." Daniel examined the camp more closely and noticed something that made his blood run cold: a company logo on one of the equipment cases. The same logo that had been on Catherine's confidential files, Davis Corporation. "They're hunting the Mustangs," he realized aloud. "But why? What's so special about wild horses that a geological survey company would risk illegal poaching?" Jack's expression darkened. It's not about the horses themselves. It's about the land. The last herds of truly wild Mustangs in this region live in areas rich with rare minerals. If the horses were gone, there would be no reason to protect the land. Daniel finished the pieces falling into place. They could open it for mining. As they continued to search the camp, Daniel found something that stopped his heart, a small piece of fabric caught on a cactus near the perimeter. The same distinctive pattern as the scraps Sophie had found, from Catherine's jacket. She was here, he whispered, clutching the fabric. Catherine found them just like she wrote in her email, and they found her. Jack placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. When the native people lose their voice, the animals speak for them, he said quietly. That's what my grandmother taught me. Perhaps that's why the ghost dancer appeared to your daughter to give voice to what Catherine discovered. Daniel was about to respond when Jack suddenly tensed, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Someone's coming, he hissed. We need to move. Now. They retreated quickly, making their way back toward the truck. As they crested a ridge, Daniel paused to look back at the canyon stretching below them, miles of labyrinthine passages where his daughter was lost. We'll find her, Jack promised, reading his thoughts. The ghost dancer has found her already, and if the stories are true, it will protect her until we can reach her. For the first time since Sophie had disappeared, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Not because of Jack's mystical beliefs, but because he now understood what they were truly facing, not just the cruel indifference of nature, but the calculated actions of men. Men could be tracked, men could be fought, men could be brought to justice. As they drove back toward the search area, Daniel made a silent vow to his missing wife and daughter. He would find the truth no matter what it cost him. Deep in the canyon, Sophie followed Shadow through a narrow passage that opened into a hidden grotto. Water trickled down one wall, feeding a small pool surrounded by lush vegetation, an oasis in the desert rock. Shadow stopped, allowing Sophie to rest. Her ankle was throbbing painfully again, and exhaustion weighed on her small frame. She sank down beside the pool, dipping her fingers into the cool water. As she looked around, something caught her eye. A small opening in the rock wall, barely visible behind a curtain of hanging vines. Curiosity overcame fatigue, and she limped toward it, pushing aside the vegetation to reveal a shallow cave. Inside, the walls were covered with ancient paintings, more elaborate than the petroglyph she had seen earlier. These depicted horses and humans in various scenes, hunting together, traveling across vast plains, standing side by side beneath stylized stars. But what made Sophie gasp was what lay at the center of the cave. Another camera, not hers, but one she recognized instantly. Her mother's professional camera, the one she had been carrying the day she disappeared. With trembling hands, Sophie picked it up. The lens was cracked, but the camera itself seemed intact. And inside was something precious beyond measure. An exposed roll of film waiting to be developed. Beside the camera lay a single page torn from a journal, the handwriting unmistakably her mother's. They're going to kill the foal. I can't let that happen. If anyone finds this, tell Daniel and Sophie, I love them more than anything. The ghost dancer has shown me what I must do. Sophie clutched the note to her chest, tears streaming down her face for the first time in months. Shadow stood in the cave entrance, watching her with those ancient, knowing eyes. She was trying to save you, Sophie whispered, or your baby. The horse nickered softly as if in confirmation. Sophie tucked the note and camera carefully into her pocket. As she did, a distant sound reached her ears, the mechanical whir of an engine echoing through the canyon walls. Shadow's ears pricked forward, its body suddenly tense. Before Sophie could react, the horse had turned and disappeared from the cave entrance. Wait! She called, scrambling after it. Outside, the peaceful grotto was no longer empty. Two men in hiking gear were approaching the pool, rifles slung over their shoulders. Sophie ducked back into the cave entrance, her heart pounding. I swear I heard voices, one man said. Probably just the wind, the other replied. This place plays tricks on your mind. Davis wants us to sweep this whole section before the search teams get here. If the kid saw anything, what's a kid gonna know? Besides, Boss says the priority is finding that black stallion. Trail camera caught it in this area yesterday. Sophie pressed herself against the rock wall, barely daring to breathe. One of the men, the second voice, was familiar. Looking carefully around the edge of the cave, she confirmed her worst fear. Mr. Davis, her father's colleague, the man who had visited their house after her mother's disappearance with hollow condolences. The men continued their search, moving closer to her hiding place. Sophie retreated deeper into the cave, searching desperately for another way out. The passage narrowed but continued back into darkness. With no other choice, she followed it, using her phone's flashlight to guide her way. Behind her, she heard the men discovering the cave. "Hey, look at this!" Sophie hurried forward, ignoring the pain in her ankle. The passage twisted and turned, gradually sloping upward. After what felt like an eternity, she saw light ahead, another opening. Emerging from the tunnel, she found herself in a different part of the canyon. The walls here were steeper, the passage narrower, and directly ahead the canyon opened onto a wider space where a small stream flowed, the same stream that had become a raging torrent during last night's flood. A movement caught her eye. Shadow stood on the opposite bank, pawing at the ground urgently. "I'm coming," Sophie called softly. She had taken only a few steps when a voice behind her froze her in place. "Sophie Winters, is that you?" She turned slowly to see Mr. Davis emerging from the tunnel, rifle lowered, but still in his hands. His expression showed surprise, quickly masked by concern. "Thank goodness you're safe," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Everyone's been searching for you. Your father is worried sick." Sophie said nothing, backing away slowly. Davis's false smile faltered. "You need to come with me now, Sophie. It's dangerous out here." "You knew my mom," Sophie said finally, her voice surprisingly steady. "You worked with her." Something flashed in Davis's eyes, surprise, then calculation. "That's right. Catherine was a valued colleague. Her loss was tragic." "She found out what you were doing," Sophie continued, backing toward the stream. "Hunting the Mustangs. Taking their land." Davis's expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're talking about, child. Now come here before you hurt yourself." The second man emerged from the tunnel, his rifle raised. "Boss, we've got company. Search team helicopters are moving into this sector." Davis cursed under his breath, then fixed Sophie with a cold stare. The Sophie Winters. What an unexpected surprise. "Now, I'm afraid we'll have to ensure you don't talk to anyone about what you've seen here, just like your mother." The threat hung in the air between them. Sophie raised her mother's camera and pressed the shutter, capturing Davis's face clearly in the frame. Davis lunged forward, but Sophie was already running, splashing into the shallow stream. A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up water near her feet. "Don't shoot her, you idiot!" Davis shouted. "We need her alive." Sophie reached the center of the stream where the water deepened, forcing her to wade. On the far bank, Shadow reared up, hooves pawing the air, a magnificent silhouette against the canyon wall. Behind her, Davis splashed into the water in pursuit. Ahead, the stream curved around a bend where the canyon narrowed dramatically. Sophie could hear the distant roar of water, the aftermath of last night's flood, still draining through the lower reaches. As she rounded the bend, her heart sank. The stream dropped off suddenly into a churning pool several feet below, swollen by the floodwaters. She was trapped on a narrow ledge, water before her, Davis behind her. Sophie turned, clutching the cameras to her chest, her last connection to her mother, the evidence of what she had discovered. Davis approached slowly, confident in his victory. "There's nowhere to go, Sophie," he said, reaching out his hand. "Be a good girl and come with me." On the far side of the pool, Shadow appeared again, its dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. Their eyes met across the distance, the girl and the horse both hunted, both alone. In that moment, Sophie made her decision. She raised her mother's camera one last time and pressed the shutter, capturing the image of Shadow against the ancient canyon walls. Then she jumped. The water closed over her head, cold and dark and powerful. She felt herself being swept away by the current, tumbling helplessly as the roar of the water filled her ears. Through the chaos, a single thought remained clear in her mind. "I'm coming, Mom. I'm following your path." And somewhere above the roar of the water, she thought she heard the defiant neigh of the ghost dancer, calling her onward into the heart of the canyon. The search helicopter hovered over the eastern quadrant of the canyon, its rotors cutting through the morning air with rhythmic precision. Inside, the pilot and two rangers scanned the labyrinth of stone below, searching for any sign of the missing girl. "Movement at 2 o'clock, the spotter called, pointing toward a narrow ravine. "Could be our target." The pilot banked the helicopter, bringing them lower for a better look. Through his binoculars, the spotter could make out two figures splashing through a shallow stream. I've got two adults male. No sign of the girl. On the ground, Thomas Davis and his associates scrambled up the canyon wall away from the approaching helicopter. Davis's face was twisted with frustration as he shouted into a satellite phone. She jumped into the lower pool. We lost her. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Yes, she had a camera, possibly with evidence. No, we couldn't retrieve it. Another pause. The search teams are closing in. We need to pull back and regroup. He disconnected the call and turned to his companion. This changes everything. If she makes it back with those photos. The other man patted his rifle. We could still find her first. Davis shook his head. Too risky with all these search teams around. We need to be smart about this. His eyes narrowed as he stared down at the churning waters where Sophie had disappeared. Besides, these canyons have already claimed one winters. They may yet claim another. Sophie tumbled through the cold, rushing water, fighting to keep her head above the surface. The current pulled her deeper into the canyon, away from Davis, but also away from any hope of rescue. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred as water splashed into her eyes. A submerged rock struck her shoulders, spinning her around. In that disorienting moment, she lost her grip on her own camera, watching helplessly as it was swept away by the current. But she clutched her mother's camera tighter, refusing to let go of this last precious link. The narrow channel suddenly widened, the water slowing as it spread across a broader area. Sophie's feet touched bottom, and with her remaining strength, she dragged herself toward the shore. Her injured ankle throbbed with renewed pain as she collapsed on a muddy bank, coughing up water and gasping for air. For several minutes, she lay still, too exhausted to move. The sun had climbed higher, warming her cold, wet clothes. Slowly, her breathing steadied, and she took stock of her situation. She was alone in an unfamiliar part of the canyon, injured with no supplies except the clothes she wore and her mother's damaged camera. The thought of Davis and his men pursuing her sent a chill down her spine, despite the warmth of the sun. "Dad," she whispered, wishing desperately that he could hear her. "Where are you?" A soft nickering answered her. Sophie raised her head to see Shadow standing a short distance away, watching her with those intelligent eyes. The black Mustang had somehow found her again, appearing like a guardian spirit when she needed help most. "You followed me," Sophie said, her voice hoarse from swallowing water. Shadow approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. The horse lowered its head, nostrils flaring as it took in her scent. Then it turned, moving along the canyon floor, pausing to look back at her expectantly. "I'm coming," Sophie promised, struggling to her feet. Her ankle could barely support her weight. Each step sent spikes of pain shooting up her leg, but she gritted her teeth and limped after Shadow. The horse seemed to understand her difficulty, walking slowly and stopping frequently to allow her to rest. As they traveled deeper into the canyon, Sophie noticed Shadow was still favoring its front leg despite her removal of the cactus spine. Looking closer, she could see the hoof was bruised and swollen. The injury went deeper than she had realized. "You're still hurt," she said, concerned. When they reached a shaded area where a small spring trickled down the canyon wall, Shadow stopped. Sophie sank gratefully to the ground, her strength nearly spent. The cool water revived her somewhat, and she drank deeply before turning her attention to Shadow's injury. The horse stood patiently as she examined the hoof again. Drawing on memories of watching her mother treat injured wildlife, Sophie cleared away small rocks and debris from the wound. She tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt, soaked it in the spring water, and gently wrapped it around the horse's hoof to keep it clean. "Mom taught me how to do this," she explained as she worked. "She helped a lot of animals. She always said they knew when you were trying to help them." Shadow remained perfectly still during the impromptu treatment, ears flicking occasionally at the sound of Sophie's voice. When she finished, the horse lowered its head until their eyes were level, blowing a soft breath that ruffled Sophie's damp hair. For a moment they stayed like that, connected by something Sophie couldn't explain, but could feel in her bones, a recognition, a trust that transcended words. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered. Shadow nickered softly, then moved to a patch of grass growing near the spring. The horse began to graze while Sophie leaned back against the canyon wall, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. Despite her dangerous situation, she felt strangely safe in Shadow's presence. Her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep, one hand still clutching her mother's camera. Miles away, Daniel and Jack had rejoined the official search operation, though they kept their discovery of the poachers' camp to themselves for now. Without concrete evidence, accusations against someone as powerful as Thomas Davis would do more harm than good. "We need to find Sophie first," Daniel insisted as they studied maps of the canyon with the search coordinator. "Once she's safe, we can deal with Davis." Martinez, the search coordinator, pointed to a section of the map where the canyon narrowed. "The helicopter spotted 2 men in this area, but no sign of your daughter. We're sending ground teams to investigate." "That's near where we found the poachers' camp," Jack whispered to Daniel. "Davis might have found her first." Daniel's face paled. "We need to get there now." "I'm sorry, Mr. Winters, but civilians need to remain at the command post," Martinez said firmly. "Our teams are well trained for this terrain." "My daughter is out there," Daniel exploded. "Possibly in danger from more than just the elements." Martinez's expression softened. "I understand your frustration, but—" He was interrupted by the arrival of a park ranger, breathless from running. "Sir, we found something. Down in the Eastern Fork." Daniel's heart stopped. "Sophie?" The ranger shook his head. "A camera, washed up on a sandbar. It's pretty beaten up, but it might belong to your daughter." Daniel took the camera with trembling hands. It was indeed Sophie's, or rather Catherine's old camera that Sophie had carried everywhere since her mother's disappearance. The sight of it damaged and abandoned sent a wave of dread through him. "If the camera washed downstream," he began, "then Sophie might have been in the water too," Jack finished grimly. Martinez immediately radioed the ground teams. "All units focus on the lower eastern channel. We may have a child in the water." As the search operation shifted focus, Daniel stood frozen, staring at the camera in his hands. It represented Sophie's last connection to Catherine. She would never have parted with it willingly. "She's alive," he said, as much to convince himself as anyone else. "She has to be." Back at the command post, Margaret and Dr. Reed waited anxiously for news. They had been relegated to the sidelines, told that too many searchers would only complicate the operation. Margaret paced restlessly, her academic composure long abandoned. "I should have told Catherine I believed her," she said, her voice thick with regret. "All those years I dismissed her interest in the legends as childish fantasy, but she was right about the ghost dancer, about everything." Dr. Reed placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. "You couldn't have known." "That's just it, I should have known." Margaret pulled Catherine's research notebook from her bag. "She sent me her findings before she disappeared. Pages of documentation about Mustang behavior that defied conventional explanation. Evidence of what she called cross-species communication. I never even opened the envelope until after the funeral." She flipped through the notebook, stopping at a page with a detailed sketch of the black horse with the lightning scar. Beside it, Catherine had written, "Not just a legend. I've seen it with my own eyes. This horse understands, really understands. It's trying to tell me something." Catherine believed the Mustang was leading her to something important. Margaret continued, "Something worth protecting." "The foal," Dr. Reed suggested. "Sophie's drawings often include a smaller horse alongside the black one." Margaret nodded slowly. "In the Navajo legend, the ghost dancer isn't just a protector of humans, it's a protector of its own kind. The last of a bloodline that stretches back to the first horses in this land." She turned to a map of the canyon spread out on a nearby table. "The Eastern Fork. That's where the old breeding grounds were located. Protected land that's been closed to the public for decades." Her finger traced a route through the maze of stone, but recently reopened for geological surveys. Dr. Reed's professional demeanor slipped, replaced by growing alarm. "You think this is about the land that Catherine found something illegal?" "I think my daughter died trying to protect something precious," Margaret replied, a new determination in her voice. "And now Sophie is following in her footsteps, whether by choice or fate, I don't know." She gathered her things, stuffing the notebook back into her bag. "I'm not sitting here any longer. I know these canyons almost as well as Jack. If anyone can guess where Sophie might have gone, it's me. The search teams won't let us join them," Dr. Reed warned. Margaret's eyes flashed with a fire that belied her age. "Then we won't ask permission." Sophie awoke to the soft nickering of shadow nearby. The sun had moved across the sky, indicating she had slept for several hours. Her clothes had dried in the desert heat, but her muscles ached and her ankle throbbed dully. Shadow stood alert, ears pricked forward, staring intently down the canyon. Sophie followed the horse's gaze but saw nothing unusual among the red stone walls. "What is it?" she whispered. Shadow pawed at the ground nervously, then began walking away from their resting place, looking back expectantly. Sophie understood the silent message and forced herself to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. They moved deeper into the canyon. Shadow setting a quicker pace now. The passage narrowed, forcing them to walk single file between towering walls of striated rock. Sophie noticed the ground sloped gradually upward, taking them higher above the canyon floor. After nearly an hour of difficult travel, they emerged onto a natural balcony overlooking a hidden valley. Sophie gasped at the sight below them. The valley was a verdant oasis in the midst of the desert canyon, a protected pocket where grass grew thick and a small, clear stream wound its way through stands of cottonwood trees. And grazing peacefully in this hidden paradise was a small herd of wild mustangs. Shadow nickered softly, and several horses below raised their heads, acknowledging the black stallion's presence. Among them, Sophie spotted a smaller black horse, a yearling with the same distinctive coloring as Shadow, though without the lightning scar. "Your family," Sophie whispered in understanding. She remembered her mother's passionate speeches about the importance of protecting wild Mustang herds, how their numbers had dwindled due to habitat loss and government roundups. Catherine had devoted her life to documenting these last truly wild horses, fighting for their protection. Now Sophie understood what her mother had discovered, not just any Mustang herd, but perhaps the last truly pristine bloodline hidden away in this secret valley. A treasure worth protecting, worth dying for. A distant sound drew her attention, the mechanical drone of an engine, out of place in this natural sanctuary. Shadow tensed beside her ears, flattening against its head. Sophie scanned the valley until she spotted the source at the far end. Partially hidden by trees was another camp, larger than the one she had seen earlier, with equipment and vehicles bearing the Davis Corporation logo. Through her mother's camera lens, she could make out men moving around the camp, some carrying rifles. One figure stood apart from the others, a man giving directions, pointing toward different areas of the valley. Even from this distance, Sophie recognized Thomas Davis. As she watched, a small group of men began setting up what looked like a corral, a trap for capturing the wild horses. Others prepared tranquilizer guns and restraints. "They're going to take them," Sophie realized aloud. "Just like Mom wrote." Shadow pawed the ground anxiously, clearly distressed by the human activity threatening the herd. The black yearling below separated from the group, trotting toward the men with youthful curiosity. Without warning, Shadow reared up and let out a piercing neigh that echoed through the canyon. The horses below immediately responded, heads raised in alarm. The yearling turned away from the men and raced back to the herd. The men in the camp reacted as well, grabbing rifles and scanning the canyon walls. Sophie ducked down, pulling Shadow away from the edge before they could be spotted. "We have to warn Dad," she whispered urgently. "We have to stop them." Shadow seemed to understand. The horse led her back down the path, moving with newfound urgency. Their journey took them through a network of narrow passages, some so tight that Sophie had to squeeze sideways to pass through. Eventually, they emerged into a broader canyon with signs of human passage footprints in the sandy soil, a discarded water bottle. Sophie felt a surge of hope. If people had been here recently, perhaps the search teams were nearby. Shadow stopped suddenly, ears pricked forward, body tense. Before Sophie could react, the horse bolted sideways, disappearing into a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. A moment later, she heard voices. "I swear I saw something move up ahead." Probably just another deer. This place is crawling with wildlife. Two men rounded the bend rifles slung over their shoulders, more of Davis's poachers. Sophie pressed herself against the rock wall, heart pounding. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. One of the men spotted her. "Hey, there's the kid." Sophie turned to flee, but her injured ankle gave way beneath her. She felt hard pain shooting up her leg. The men approached quickly, one reaching for a radio on his belt. "We found the Winters girl, eastern sector near marker 7. The other man reached for Sophie's arm. "Come on, kid. Boss wants to talk to you." "No!" Sophie lashed out, clutching her mother's camera tightly. "Get away from me!" A thunderous sound filled the canyon, the pounding of hooves on stone. Shadow burst from the crevice, charging directly at the men with teeth bared and eyes wild. The men fell back in surprise, scrambling for their weapons. But Shadow was faster, rearing up between them, and Sophie hooves slashing at the air in a terrifying display. "Shoot it!" one man yelled, raising his rifle. Sophie screamed, "No!" The shot echoed through the canyon. Shadow flinched, but remained standing, a red streak appearing on its flank where the bullet had grazed the horse's side. Before the men could fire again, Shadow kicked out with its hind legs, catching one man squarely in the chest. He went down hard, his rifle clattering across the stone. The second man backed away, still aiming at Shadow. "Easy now," he said, his voice shaking. "Easy, you devil horse." Shadow advanced, forcing the man to retreat further. Sophie seized her opportunity. Ignoring the pain in her ankle, she lunged forward and grabbed the fallen rifle, pointing it unsteadily at the second poacher. "Drop it!" she demanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "Drop your gun." The man hesitated, eyes darting between the wild-eyed horse and the determined child. Slowly, he lowered his weapon to the ground. "Now go," Sophie ordered. "Tell Davis I know what he did to my mom. Tell him I have proof." The man backed away, then turned and ran, leaving his unconscious companion behind. Sophie lowered the rifle, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. Shadow approached her, nickering, softly nudging her shoulder with its muzzle. Blood trickled down the horse's side from the bullet graze. "You're hurt," Sophie said, reaching toward the wound. When her fingers touched Shadow's coat, something extraordinary happened. The world around her seemed to shimmer and fade, replaced by a vision so vivid it took her breath away. She saw her mother, Catherine, crouched behind a rock outcropping with a camera in hand. Through the lens, she was photographing the same camp Sophie had just discovered. Then Catherine was running a small black foal, a younger Shadow at her heels, pursued by armed men. A shot rang out, and Catherine stumbled, falling toward a steep drop-off. With her last strength, she pushed the young Shadow away from the edge, whispering something to the frightened animal before she fell from sight. Sophie gasped as the vision ended, tears streaming down her face. "Mom," she whispered, "you died saving Shadow." The horse gazed at her with those ancient, knowing eyes, and in that moment, Sophie understood. Shadow hadn't found her by accident. Catherine had sent the horse to find her daughter, to continue what she had started. "She told you to find me, didn't she?" Sophie asked, her voice breaking with emotion. Her last words. "She told you to find me." Shadow pressed his muzzle against her cheek as if confirming her realization. The connection between them was no longer just intuitive. It was a living link to her mother, a promise kept across the barrier of death itself. Sophie wiped away her tears, a new determination, replacing her fear. "We need to find Dad. We need to stop Davis before he destroys everything Mom tried to protect." Buddy, Daniel and Jack had abandoned the official search teams, striking out on their own, based on Jack's intimate knowledge of the canyon system. Jack believed he knew where the Mustang herd might be found, in the same hidden valley where his sister had been discovered 30 years ago. "If the ghost dancer has found Sophie, that's where it will take her," Jack insisted, "to the place where the bloodline has survived for centuries." They hiked in tense silence, Jack leading the way through passages that appeared on no official map. As they traveled, Daniel's mind raced with questions. "These visions you mentioned, your sister, the other children who were rescued, what exactly did they see?" Jack chose his words carefully. "Not all experienced visions. Some simply reported being led to safety by a black horse. Others described moments of connection, glimpses of events they couldn't possibly have witnessed, memories that weren't their own." "You're suggesting some kind of psychic link?" Daniel asked skeptically. "I'm not suggesting anything," Jack replied. "I'm telling you what has been reported by dozens of witnesses over decades. What you choose to believe is up to you." They reached a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Jack pointed to marks on the stone beside the opening, symbols carved by ancient hands. The old ones knew about this place. They considered it sacred, a doorway between worlds. Daniel examined the petroglyphs, stylized horses and human figures, intertwined in ways that suggested communication or communion rather than dominance. "Catherine found these, didn't she?" he asked quietly. Jack nodded. She was connecting the dots that anthropologists like your mother-in-law had missed the relationship between these symbols and actual Mustang behavior. She believed the ancient people weren't just recording myths, but actual experiences. They squeezed through the fissure into a tunnel that gradually widened. Jack switched on a flashlight as the daylight faded behind them. She sent me her findings a week before she disappeared, Jack continued. Documentation of behaviors that couldn't be explained by conventional science Mustangs that seemed to anticipate flash floods, hours before they occurred, that led lost hikers to water sources they couldn't possibly have known about, that showed up at exactly the right moment to prevent accidents. Coincidences, Daniel argued, though his conviction was weakening. Pattern recognition. We humans are wired to see meaning in random events. Maybe, Jack conceded, or maybe there is more to this world than your science can explain. Catherine thought so. They emerged from the tunnel onto a ledge overlooking the hidden valley. Daniel gasped at the unexpected oasis spread out before them. My God, he whispered. It's beautiful. Jack pointed to the far end of the valley. Davis's men are already here, setting up for a capture operation from the looks of it. Daniel squinted, making out the distant camp with its vehicles and equipment. Anger surged through him at the sight of the Davis Corporation logo. We need to get down there, he said. Find Sophie before they do. Jack held him back. Look. On the valley floor, a group of wild Mustangs grazed peacefully, unaware of the threat gathering at the far end. Among them was a black yearling, strikingly similar to the horse in Sophie's drawings. Shadow's offspring, Jack said. The next generation of the bloodline. That's what Catherine was trying to protect. Daniel scanned the valley for any sign of his daughter, but saw nothing. Where's Sophie? Where's this ghost dancer you're so certain is protecting her? Patience, Jack counseled. The ghost dancer moves between worlds. It will reveal itself when the time is right. They began their descent into the valley, staying close to the rock wall to avoid being spotted by Davis's men. Daniel's scientific mind struggled with Jack's mystical explanations, yet he couldn't deny the evidence. Before his eyes, the hidden valley exactly as Jack had described it, the black yearling that matched Sophie's drawings. What if Catherine had been right all along? What if there was something extraordinary about these horses, something worth protecting at any cost? The sound of a gunshot echoed through the canyon, startling the grazing horses into motion. Daniel froze, his heart seizing in his chest. Sophie, he whispered, terror gripping him. We have to hurry. Margaret and Dr. Reed had borrowed an ATV from the search operations motor pool, following Margaret's instincts and memories of the canyon system. Margaret drove with surprising skill for her age, navigating the rough terrain with determined focus. Catherine used to bring me maps of these canyons, she explained as they bounced along a narrow trail, begging me to confirm if they matched the locations in the old legends. I dismissed her, told her to focus on her scientific research instead of chasing myths. You couldn't have known, Dr. Reed said, clinging to her seat as they rounded a sharp bend. That's the point, Margaret replied. I should have been open to the possibility. All my academic career, I documented the stories of indigenous people, their connections to the land, their relationships with animals. But when it came to my own daughter's experiences, I chose skepticism over belief. They came to a fork in the trail. Margaret hesitated, then chose the path leading deeper into the canyon system. In the oldest version of the ghost dancer legend, she continued, the horse wasn't just a protector of lost children. It was a messenger between the living and the dead, a guide that could lead the bereaved to understanding and peace. Dr. Reed considered this. You think that's what's happening with Sophie? That this connection she's formed is helping her process Catherine's death? I think it's more than that, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I think Catherine found something real, something that blurs the line between myth and reality, and now Sophie has found it too. They rounded another bend and came face to face with a search party, park rangers and volunteers combing the area on foot. Dr. Winters, one ranger called out in surprise, you shouldn't be out here. Margaret straightened her spine, summoning the authoritative presence that had served her well in decades of academia. I've been studying these canyons for 40 years, young man. I believe my granddaughter has been taken to the hidden valley, the one that doesn't appear on your official maps. The rangers exchanged confused glances. Ma'am, all the areas in the park are mapped. Not this one, Margaret insisted. It's protected knowledge kept off the books to preserve a cultural site important to the Navajo people. Dr. Reed watched in admiration as Margaret, who hours ago had been wringing her hands in helpless worry, now commanded the attention of trained professionals with the confident expertise of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Jack Reynolds knows the way, Margaret continued. He and my son-in-law are likely already heading there. We need to coordinate our efforts. The lead ranger stepped forward. Dr. Winters, with all due respect, we can't divert resources based on local legends. Margaret's eyes flashed. Then I suggest you contact the tribal liaison office immediately. Ask them about the Valley of the Ghost Dancer. And while you're at it, you might want to look into why a geological survey company has armed men operating illegally in a restricted area of the park. That got their attention. The ranger reached for his radio, stepping away to make the call. When he returned, his expression had changed completely. We've been instructed to follow your lead, Dr. Winters. Apparently there are jurisdictional sensitivities we weren't briefed on. Margaret allowed herself a small smile of triumph. Then I suggest we hurry. My granddaughter's life may depend on it. Sophie and Shadow moved quickly through the canyon, following a route that seemed to be leading them back toward the main search area. Despite her injured ankle, Sophie pushed on, driven by a new sense of purpose. The rifle she had taken from the poacher was slung awkwardly over her shoulder, not because she intended to use it, but to prevent it from being used against Shadow again. The horse stayed close by her side, occasionally offering its strong neck for support when the terrain became difficult. The bullet graze on Shadow's flank had stopped bleeding, but Sophie worried about infection. We'll get help soon, she promised, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring the horse or herself. They came to a junction where three canyons met. Shadow hesitated, as if unsure which path to take. Sophie studied their options, trying to recall the maps her mother had shown her of the area. A distant rumble caught her attention, the sound of vehicles approaching. Shadow's ears pricked forward, its body tensing. Is it Davis? Sophie whispered. The horse pawed at the ground, then turned toward the leftmost canyon, urging her to follow. They had gone only a short distance when Shadow stopped abruptly, ears flicking back and forth. The horse turned, blocking Sophie's path, preventing her from going further. What is it? She asked. Shadow nudged her backward, insistent. Sophie hesitated, then understood danger lay ahead. Just as she turned to retreat, voices echoed around the bend. The tracks lead this way. Fresh hoof prints and a child's footprints. Davis's men had found their trail. Sophie and Shadow backtracked quickly to the junction, taking the rightmost path instead. This canyon was narrower, its walls steeper, offering few places to hide. The voices grew louder behind them. Sophie's ankle throbbed with each step, slowing their escape. Shadow stayed beside her, matching its pace to her limping gait. They rounded a bend and Sophie's heart sank. Ahead, the canyon ended in a sheer wall, a dead end. They were trapped. Now what? She whispered, fighting back tears of frustration. Shadow nudged her toward a pile of fallen rocks at the base of the wall. Sophie saw it then, a small opening barely visible behind the debris, a cave or tunnel that might offer escape. She limped toward it, Shadow following close behind. The opening was small, just large enough for Sophie to squeeze through if she removed her backpack, but it was far too small for a horse. You can't come with me, Sophie realized, turning to Shadow with dismay. The horse nickered softly, nudging her toward the opening again. The voices were closer now. They had only moments before they would be discovered. I can't leave you, Sophie protested, tears filling her eyes. Shadow reared slightly, pawing at the air, then turned as if preparing to run back the way they had come. Understanding dawned. You're going to lead them away, Sophie whispered. The horse pressed its muzzle against her cheek one last time, a gesture so gentle and purposeful that it broke Sophie's heart. Then Shadow turned and galloped back toward the junction, making no attempt to move quietly. Sophie heard the men shout in the distance, their attention drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. With tears streaming down her face, she removed her backpack, clutching only her mother's camera, as she squeezed through the narrow opening into darkness. Inside, the passage widened enough for her to stand. Faint light filtered in from somewhere ahead enough to guide her way. Sophie moved forward, her mind filled with worry for Shadow. Had she just sent her protector, her only friend in this wilderness, to certain death? The passage continued for what felt like an eternity, gradually sloping upward. Sophie's ankle screamed with pain, but she pressed on, driven by desperation and the need to honor Shadow's sacrifice. Eventually, the passage opened onto a narrow ledge high above the canyon floor. Sophie emerged into sunlight, blinking as her eyes adjusted after the darkness of the tunnel. The ledge offered a panoramic view of the surrounding canyons, including the hidden valley in the distance. From this vantage point, she could see everything: the Mustang herd, Davis's camp, and the search teams converging from multiple directions. Movement below caught her attention. A black shape raced along the canyon floor, Shadow, with Davis's men in pursuit. The horse was leading them away from Sophie's hiding place exactly as planned. But the men were gaining. One raised his rifle, taking aim at the fleeing horse. "No!" Sophie screamed, though she knew they couldn't hear her from this distance. A shot rang out, echoing across the canyon. Shadow stumbled but kept running, disappearing around a bend with the men close behind. Sophie sank to her knees, overwhelmed by helplessness and grief. Shadow had risked everything to protect her, just as her mother had done a year ago. As tears blurred her vision, she raised her mother's camera one last time, focusing on the distant valley, where the Mustang herd still grazed peacefully, unaware of the danger approaching from all sides. She pressed the shutter, capturing what Catherine had died trying to protect. "I promise, Mom," she whispered. "I'll finish what you started." Daniel and Jack had reached the valley floor and were making their way cautiously toward the Mustang herd when they heard the gunshot. The horses scattered in alarm, the black yearling racing toward the center of the valley. "They've spotted the ghost dancer," Jack said grimly. "We need to hurry." They moved faster, keeping to the cover of trees and rock formations. As they approached the herd, Daniel noticed something odd. The horses were forming a protective circle around the black yearling, a behavior he had never witnessed before. "They're protecting it," he said in wonder. Jack nodded. "The bloodline must survive. They all know it, not just the ghost dancer." A second shot echoed through the canyon, this one closer. Daniel's heart raced with fear for Sophie. "We need to split up," he decided. "You stay with the herd. I'll head toward the gunfire." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful. Davis's men won't hesitate to silence any witnesses." Daniel moved swiftly along the edge of the valley, heading toward the sound of the shots. As he rounded a large boulder, he came face to face with Thomas Davis himself, accompanied by two armed men. Davis recovered quickly from his surprise. "Daniel, thank God. We've been searching for your daughter." "Save it, Davis," Daniel said coldly. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the poaching, the illegal surveys. I know you're after the Mustangs." Davis's friendly facade hardened. "Don't be ridiculous. We're here to help with the search, nothing more." "Then why are your men carrying tranquilizer guns?" Daniel demanded, pointing to the specialized equipment partially hidden under one man's jacket. Davis sighed, dropping all pretense. "You always were too smart for your own good, Daniel. Just like Catherine. She couldn't leave well enough alone either." The casual mention of his wife's name in this context sent a surge of rage through Daniel. "What did you do to her?" "Nothing," Davis said, spreading his hands. "Nature took care of that problem for us. A tragic accident during a flash flood. At least that's what the official report says." "You bastard!" Daniel growled, stepping forward. The armed men raised their rifles, but Davis held up a hand to stop them. "Let's be reasonable, Daniel. This isn't about the horses, it's about what's beneath this valley. Rare earth minerals worth billions. The Mustangs are just an obstacle to progress. They're a protected species on protected land," Daniel countered. Davis shrugged. "Which is why they need to disappear quietly. No Mustangs, no reason to maintain the protection status. Simple economics." "And Sophie, is she an obstacle too?" A shadow crossed Davis's face. "Unfortunately, your daughter has seen things she shouldn't have. She has evidence photographs that could be problematic for our operation." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "If you've hurt her—" "We haven't found her yet," Davis interrupted. "But my men are closing in. When they do—" He left the threat hanging. Before Daniel could respond, a new sound filled the air, the whirring of helicopter rotors. A search and rescue chopper appeared overhead, circling the valley. More vehicles could be heard approaching along the canyon floor. Davis cursed under his breath. This conversation isn't over, Daniel. Think about your daughter's future. Some battles aren't worth fighting. He signaled to his men and they retreated quickly toward their camp. Daniel watched them go, torn between pursuing them and continuing his search for Sophie. The decision was made for him when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Dad, Dad, I'm here. Daniel turned to see Sophie standing on a ledge high above the valley floor, waving frantically. Despite her distance, he could see she was alive. Dirty, injured, but alive. Sophie, Sharon. He shouted, relief flooding through him. Stay there, I'm coming. He began climbing toward her, scrambling up the steep canyon wall with desperate energy. Nothing mattered now except reaching his daughter, holding her in his arms again. As he climbed, more search teams poured into the valley below. Among them, he spotted Margaret and Dr. Reed directing rangers toward Davis's camp. Sophie watched her father's approach, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and urgency. She needed to tell him everything about Shadow, about Davis, about her mother's discovery. But most of all, she needed to tell him about the yearling, the last of Shadow's bloodlines still in danger, as long as Davis remained free. When Daniel finally reached the ledge, Sophie threw herself into his arms, crying openly for the first time since Catherine's death. Dad, she sobbed. I found Mom's camera. I know what happened to her. Daniel held her tightly, his own tears flowing freely. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. That's all that matters. No. Sophie pulled back, her expression urgent. It's not just about me. It's about Shadow, the ghost dancer. Mom died trying to protect it and its baby. Davis shot Shadow. We have to find it. Daniel looked into his daughter's eyes that had been empty for so long now, filled with passion and purpose. Shadow, he asked gently. The black horse with the lightning scar. Sophie explained rapidly. The one in my drawings. It found me after the flood, Dad. It protected me, led me to water, showed me where Mom had been. It saved me from Davis's men, and now it's hurt because of me. Daniel hesitated, scientific skepticism warring with the undeniable fact that his daughter was speaking again, that she had somehow survived days alone in the wilderness. Shadow is real, Sophie insisted, reading his doubt, and it knows things about Mom. When I touched it, I saw... Her voice faltered. What did you see, Sophie? I saw Mom die, she whispered. She was protecting Shadow's baby from Davis's men. She fell from the cliff, but before she did, she told Shadow to find me. And it did, Dad. It found me. Daniel looked down at the valley below, where park rangers were now confronting Davis and his men, confiscating equipment and weapons. Jack stood with the Mustang herd, the black yearling, close by his side. I believe you, he said, finally surprising himself with the truth of those words. And we're going to help Shadow, but first we need to get you to safety. Sophie shook her head stubbornly. Not until I know Shadow is okay. Please, Dad, I promised. Daniel recognized the determination in her eyes, Catherine's determination. With a sigh, he nodded. All right, let's find your ghost dancer. Together, they began their descent from the ledge, Sophie leaning on her father for support as they made their way carefully down the steep slope. Below, the confrontation between the Rangers and Davis's men had escalated, with Davis himself being placed in handcuffs. Margaret spotted them first, pointing and calling out to the others. A medical team rushed forward as Daniel and Sophie reached the valley floor. As the paramedics examined Sophie's injured ankle, she kept scanning the canyon, looking for any sign of Shadow. The black yearling approached cautiously, drawn by Sophie's presence, but there was no sign of the older horse. We need to find Shadow, Sophie insisted, resisting the paramedics' attempts to load her onto a stretcher. It's hurt. It needs help. Jack approached, kneeling beside her. The ghost dancer is strong, Sophie. It has survived in these canyons for decades. But Davis's men shot it, Sophie argued, tears filling her eyes again. It was bleeding. It led them away to protect me. Jack's expression grew serious. Where did you last see it? Sophie pointed toward the narrow canyon where they had been separated. There. It ran back toward the junction, with Davis's men chasing it. Jack nodded and stood. I'll find it. You go with your father, get that ankle treated. Promise you'll look for Shadow, Sophie pleaded. I promise, Jack assured her. The ghost dancer and I are old friends. As Jack hurried away, Daniel helped Sophie onto the stretcher. The paramedics began carrying her toward a waiting helicopter, with Daniel walking alongside holding her hand. Dad, Sophie said quietly, I have Mom's camera. There's film inside pictures she took of Davis's operation, and I took more. It's evidence. Daniel carefully took the damaged camera. We'll make sure it gets to the right people, sweetheart. Davis won't get away with this. As they reached the helicopter, Margaret rushed forward, embracing her granddaughter, with tears streaming down her face. Sophie, she cried. Oh, my brave, brave girl. Sophie hugged her grandmother tightly. You were right, Grandma. About the legends, about everything. The ghost dancer is real. Margaret nodded, stroking Sophie's tangled hair. I know, darling. I should have believed your mother when she told me the same thing. The paramedics loaded Sophie into the helicopter, with Daniel climbing in beside her. Margaret stepped back, promising to meet them at the hospital. As the helicopter lifted off, Sophie pressed her face to the window, scanning the canyon below one last time for any sign of shadow. The valley spread out beneath them, the grazing Mustangs, the Rangers, securing Davis's illegal operation. The ancient landscape unchanged by the human drama unfolding within it. In the distance, at the edge of a narrow ravine, Sophie caught a glimpse of movement, a black shape watching the helicopter rise. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the impossible distance. Shadow, she whispered, placing her hand against the glass. The black horse reared up, silhouetted against the canyon wall, a powerful image of wild freedom. Then it turned and disappeared into the labyrinth of stone, carrying Catherine's final message, and Sophie's enduring connection into the heart of the ancient landscape. As the helicopter carried her away from the canyon, Sophie closed her eyes, feeling not the grief that had consumed her for a year, but a new sensation: peace. Whatever had happened to her mother, whatever mystical connection had brought shadow into her life, one thing was certain: she was no longer alone in her pain. For the first time since Catherine's death, Sophie spoke her deepest truth aloud. I'm ready to live again, Mom. I'm ready to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Daniel squeezed her hand, his heart full of wonder at the transformation in his daughter. The mystery of the ghost dancer might never be fully explained, but its impact was undeniable. Sophie had found her voice again, and with it a purpose that would honor Catherine's memory far better than silence ever could. The floodwaters had risen again, turning the narrow stream into a churning torrent. Sophie stood on a flat rock in the middle of the rushing current, the water climbing inch by inch toward her feet. Across the channel, Shadow waited on the far bank, wounded in weakening blood, trickling from the bullet wound in its flank. Sophie stared at the distance between them, 10 feet of violent water that might as well have been a mile. She had two choices: run toward safety and abandon Shadow, or risk the dangerous crossing to help the horse that had saved her life multiple times. In her hands, she clutched her mother's camera, the physical evidence of Davis's crimes, and the key to justice for Catherine's death. If she attempted the crossing and failed, that evidence might be lost forever. Sophie took a deep breath, securing the camera firmly inside her jacket. Then, without further hesitation, she stepped off the rock and into the rushing water. The current instantly seized her, dragging her downstream as she fought to keep her head above the surface. Her injured ankle made swimming nearly impossible, leaving her at the mercy of the flood. But she kept her eyes fixed on Shadow, using the horse as her beacon, fighting with every ounce of strength to angle toward the far bank. Halfway across, her strength began to fail. Water filled her mouth, her vision dimmed, and for a moment she thought she might join her mother in whatever lay beyond this life. Then something impossible happened. Shadow plunged into the water, powerful muscles driving against the current. The horse reached Sophie in seconds, positioning its body to break the force of the water. Sophie grabbed handfuls of the dark mane, and with the last of her energy, pulled herself onto Shadow's back. Together they fought the remaining distance to shore the horse's strength, doing what Sophie's could not. When they finally reached the bank, Sophie slid from Shadow's back, collapsing onto the muddy ground in exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching up to touch the horse's muzzle. Shadow stood over her protectively, though its own strength was clearly fading. The bullet wound continued to bleed, and its breathing came in labored gasps. Sophie forced herself to her feet, ignoring her own pain. "Now it's my turn to save you." Miles away, Daniel and Jack raced along the canyon rim in Jack's truck, following coordinates radioed from the search helicopter that had spotted signs of human activity near a tributary stream. The pilot reported seeing two of Davis's men retreating from that area, Jack explained as they bounced over the rough terrain, and possible blood trails. Daniel's knuckles whitened as he gripped the dashboard. Blood, Sophie's blood. Unknown, Jack replied grimly. But the good news is they didn't see Sophie with the men. She might have evaded them. Or they might have. Daniel couldn't finish the sentence. Jack shot him a stern look. Don't go there. Your daughter has survived days in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. She's Catherine's daughter, tough as they come. The mention of Catherine brought a fresh wave of grief and anger. Davis's casual admission of involvement in her death had reopened wounds Daniel thought had begun to heal. Davis confessed, he said quietly. Not directly, but he made it clear Catherine's death wasn't an accident. Jack nodded, his weathered face revealing no surprise. I suspected as much when I found her backpack. The straps were cut, not torn. Someone wanted it to look like an accident. You knew, Daniel demanded, anger flaring. All this time. I had suspicions, not proof, Jack replied calmly. And a man like Davis is untouchable without hard evidence. That's why Catherine's camera is so important. If she documented what she found, we can finally bring him to justice. They reached a ridge overlooking a narrow tributary canyon. Below, they could see the swollen stream, evidence of another localized downpour upstream. There, Jack pointed to movement near the water's edge. Daniel squinted, then his heart leaped. It's Sophie and the horse Shadow. Without waiting for Jack, Daniel scrambled down the slope toward his daughter, sliding and stumbling in his haste. As he drew closer, he could see Sophie tending to the black horse, which stood with head lowered, clearly injured. Sophie, he called out. She turned, relief washing over her face. Dad's Shadow's hurt bad, he needs help. Daniel reached his daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace before examining her condition. She was soaking wet, covered in mud, and limping badly, but the determination in her eyes reminded him so much of Catherine that it took his breath away. You're supposed to be at the hospital, he scolded gently. I couldn't leave, Sophie explained. Not without knowing Shadow was safe. He saved me. Dad jumped into the flood to get me out, but he's been shot and he's losing blood. Daniel turned his attention to the magnificent black horse. Even wounded and exhausted, Shadow radiated a wild dignity that commanded respect. The horse regarded Daniel with intelligent eyes, neither fearful nor aggressive, simply watchful. The bullet grazed his side, Sophie explained, pointing to the bleeding wound. It doesn't look deep, but he's lost a lot of blood, and I'm worried about infection. Jack joined them, approaching the injured horse with careful movements. The ghost dancer, he said softly with reverence in his voice. After all these years. Shadow's ears flicked toward Jack, recognition seeming to pass between them. You know each other? Sophie asked, surprised. Jack nodded. When I was a boy, this horse, or perhaps its ancestor, led me to my sister when she was lost. I've caught glimpses of it over the decades, but never this close. He knelt beside the wound, examining it with practiced eyes. The bullet left a clean track. With proper treatment, he should recover. He looked up at Daniel. But we need to get him to a vet, and soon. The helicopter can't transport a wild horse, Daniel said, thinking out loud. And even if it could, no vet around here would treat a Mustang without proper authorization. Then we need to bring the vet to him, Sophie declared, and get whatever authorization we need. Jack smiled at her determination. There's a Navajo veterinarian on the reservation who works with the Park Service, Dr. Begay. She understands the importance of the ghost dancer bloodline. Daniel made a quick decision. I'll go back to the command post and arrange everything. You two stay with Shadow, keep him stable. Sophie nodded gratefully. Hurry, Dad. As Daniel turned to leave, Sophie called after him. Wait, take Mom's camera. The film inside is evidence against Davis. Make sure it gets developed right away. Daniel accepted the damaged camera with careful hands. I'll protect it with my life, he promised. As he climbed back up the slope, Daniel glanced back at his daughter sitting beside the black horse, her hand gently stroking its neck, her lips moving in what appeared to be a one-sided conversation. The image struck him with a profound sense of déjà vu. How many times had he seen Catherine in exactly the same position, communing with the wild creatures she had devoted her life to protecting. For the first time since losing his wife, Daniel felt not just grief, but a deep, abiding pride. Catherine's spirit lived on in their daughter, her compassion, her courage, her unwavering commitment to protecting the voiceless. And perhaps in ways his scientific mind was only beginning to comprehend, Catherine's presence lived on in the mysterious connection between Sophie and this extraordinary horse. At the field hospital set up near the canyon rim, Margaret paced anxiously, her academic composure completely abandoned. When she had learned that Sophie had somehow left the medical helicopter before reaching the hospital, she had nearly collapsed with renewed fear. She was supposed to be safe, she repeated to Dr. Reed, who sat nearby, maintaining a professional calm despite her own concern. How could they lose her again? From what the pilot reported, she was quite insistent about going back for the horse, Dr. Reed replied. They landed to refuel and she simply disappeared. Margaret shook her head in exasperation and pride. Stubborn, just like her mother. Just like me, if I'm being honest. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Daniel burst in, his face flushed from exertion. Daniel! Margaret rushed toward him. Sophie! She's safe, he assured her quickly. She's with Jack in the horse Shadow. It's injured and needs medical attention. Relief flooded Margaret's features, followed quickly by confusion. She went back for a wild horse. Not just any horse. Daniel explained, his voice betraying a new conviction that surprised even him. The ghost dancer, the one from your research, the one Catherine was tracking. Margaret's eyes widened. You've seen it, and you believe. I believe our daughter has formed a connection with this animal that defies conventional explanation, Daniel replied carefully. And I believe Catherine might have experienced something similar before she died. He held up the damaged camera. Sophie found this Catherine's professional camera with exposed film still inside, and she has her own photos as well. Together they provide evidence of Davis's illegal activities in the canyon. Davis, Margaret's expression hardened. I heard they've arrested him. Temporarily, Daniel said grimly, for trespassing on restricted federal land. But without hard evidence of the poaching operation and his connection to Catherine's death, he'll be released within hours. Then we need to develop that film immediately, Margaret declared. The Rangers have a field lab for documenting evidence, Dr. Reed suggested. They might be able to help. Daniel nodded. I'm heading there now, but first we need to arrange for a veterinarian to treat Shadow. Sophie won't leave his side until she knows he'll recover. Margaret's expression softened. I'll contact the tribal council. Catherine worked closely with them on conservation issues. They'll help us for her sake. As they split up to handle these urgent tasks, Daniel felt a newfound appreciation for his mother-in-law. The academic skeptic had given way to a woman of action, drawing on decades of connections and knowledge to help her granddaughter. Perhaps they had all underestimated Margaret's capacity for belief. As the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim, painting the stone walls in shades of orange and gold, Sophie sat with Shadow in a small clearing near the stream. Jack had built a makeshift shelter using branches and his jacket, providing some protection from the elements. The old guide had cleaned Shadow's wound as best he could with water from the stream and a first aid kit from his truck. The bleeding had slowed, but the horse's breathing remained labored, its head hanging low with exhaustion. Will he be okay? Sophie asked, her voice small with worry. Jack considered the question carefully. The ghost dancer has survived far worse than this over the decades, but even legends need help sometimes. Sophie nodded, continuing to stroke Shadow's neck gently. The horse leaned into her touch, finding comfort in her presence, just as she had found comfort in his. I saw Mom, she said suddenly. When I touched Shadow earlier, I saw her last moments. She was protecting Shadow's foal from Davis's men. She fell from the cliff, but before she did, she told Shadow to find me. Jack nodded, unsurprised. The old stories say the ghost dancer carries memories, not just its own, but those of the people and animals connected to it. Some call it magic. Others might call it a form of communication we've forgotten how to understand. Do you think, Sophie hesitated, almost afraid to voice the question, do you think part of Mom is still here somehow? In Shadow, Jack gazed at the wounded horse with thoughtful eyes. The Navajo believed that death is not an ending, but a transition. The spirit continues its journey, sometimes leaving echoes behind in the places and beings it loved most. He gestured to the canyon around them. Catherine loved this land, these horses. Is it so hard to believe that her love might have created a bridge, a connection that even death couldn't sever completely? Sophie considered this, her young mind grappling with concepts that adults spent lifetimes trying to understand. I think I'd know if Mom was really gone, she said finally. I'd feel it here. She placed a hand over her heart. But I don't. When I'm with Shadow, it's like she's right beside me, showing me the way. Jack smiled gently. Then perhaps she is. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several vehicles. Daniel emerged from the lead truck, accompanied by a Navajo woman carrying medical supplies and a park ranger in uniform. Dr. Begay, Jack greeted the woman with respect. Thank you for coming. The veterinarian nodded, her eyes immediately drawn to Shadow. So it's true. The ghost dancer has returned. She approached slowly, speaking softly in Navajo as she moved closer to the injured horse. Shadow watched her cautiously, but made no move to flee, seeming to sense her healing intent. I need to examine the wound, Dr. Begay explained to Sophie. Will he let me touch him? Sophie looked at Shadow, a silent communication passing between them. Then she nodded. If I stay with him, yes. With Sophie's reassuring presence, Dr. Begay was able to examine and clean the wound properly. She administered antibiotics and pain medication, explaining each step to Sophie as she worked. The bullet left a clean track through the muscle, she reported. No major vessels were hit. With proper care and rest, he should make a full recovery. Relief washed over Sophie's face. Thank you. The park ranger stepped forward, looking somewhat uncomfortable. We've received authorization from the Tribal Council and the Park Service Director to establish a temporary protected area here. No one will disturb the horse while it recovers. Daniel placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. The rangers are setting up a special medical tent nearby. We can stay close to Shadow while he heals. Sophie looked up at her father gratefully. You believe me now about Shadow being special? Daniel knelt beside her, choosing his words carefully. I believe you formed an extraordinary bond with an extraordinary animal, and I believe your mother would be incredibly proud of how you fought to protect what she valued. He hesitated, then continued. As for the visions, the connection you feel to your mother through Shadow, I don't have scientific explanations for those things, but I don't need to understand something completely to recognize its importance. Sophie threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. Thank you, Dad. As darkness fell, lanterns illuminated the small camp that had formed around Shadow. The horse rested more comfortably now, the medication easing its pain. Sophie refused to leave its side, so Daniel arranged for blankets and food to be brought to them. Margaret arrived as the stars began to appear, bringing news that sent a surge of anticipation through the group. They've developed the film from both cameras, she announced. The Park Service investigator wants us to come identify the images first thing tomorrow morning. I'm not leaving Shadow, Sophie declared immediately. Margaret smiled, having anticipated this response, which is why I convinced them to bring the photos here instead. Daniel looked at his mother-in-law with newfound respect. How did you manage that? Margaret's eyes twinkled with a hint of her old academic authority. I might have mentioned my 30 years of anthropological research grants to the park and my close personal friendship with the Secretary of the Interior. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie laughed, a genuine sound of delight that warmed Daniel's heart. As the night deepened around them, Sophie eventually drifted to sleep beside Shadow, her hand resting on the horse's neck, their breathing falling into a synchronized rhythm. Daniel watched over them, his mind filled with questions that had no easy answers. Nearby, Jack and Margaret sat by a small fire, speaking quietly. She's healing, Margaret observed, watching her granddaughter sleep peacefully for the first time in a year. Jack nodded. The ghost dancer has that effect. It finds those who are lost not just physically, but spiritually. I should have believed Catherine, Margaret said, regret heavy in her voice. All those years I dismissed her research as romantic fantasy, trying to push her toward more serious science. You were protecting her in your own way. Jack replied gently. After losing one daughter, you wanted certainty for the other, the solid ground of provable facts. Margaret gazed into the fire memories playing across her features. Jenny loved the old stories too. She used to beg me to tell her about the spirit animals of the canyon, especially the ghost dancer. After she died, I couldn't bear to speak of them anymore. And now? Jack asked. Margaret looked towards Sophie and Shadow, their silhouettes illuminated by the moonlight. Now I wonder if Jenny found her own ghost dancer in the end, a guide to help her cross over. Jack said nothing, but his silence held a wealth of understanding. The world is larger than our understanding of it, Margaret said finally. Catherine knew that. Sophie knows it. Perhaps it's time I remembered it too. Morning brought clarity to the canyon, the rising sun burning away the night's shadows and illuminating the red stone walls in brilliant detail. Sophie awoke to find Shadow standing the horse's condition noticeably improved. Its eyes were brighter, its posture stronger though it still favored its injured side. You look better, Sophie said, relief evident in her voice. Shadow nickered softly in response, nudging her shoulder with its muzzle. Dr. Bigai arrived to check on her patient, smiling at the visible improvement. He's strong. Wild horses have remarkable healing capabilities when given proper care. When will he be able to return to his herd? Sophie asked, her joy at Shadow's recovery, tempered by the knowledge that their time together was limited. A few days, perhaps a week, the veterinarian replied. The wound needs to close completely before he can resume normal activity. Sophie nodded, accepting this reality with a maturity beyond her years. She understood that Shadow belonged to the wild, to the canyon, to its herd, including the black yearlings she had seen in the hidden valley. A Park Service vehicle arrived, bringing the investigator with the developed photographs. The images were laid out carefully on a folding table protected in clear plastic sleeves. Sophie's photos came first: images of Davis's men in the canyon, the poaching camp, the hidden valley with its Mustang herd, and most damning of all, a clear shot of Davis himself holding a rifle and giving orders to armed men in a protected wilderness area. But it was Catherine's photographs that left them breathless. The professional quality images documented months of surveillance, Davis's men capturing and removing Mustangs under cover of darkness, the construction of hidden roads into restricted areas, geological survey equipment being used to locate mineral deposits in the protected valley. The final images in Catherine's role were the most disturbing, a sequence showing Davis's men pursuing a young Shadow and its mother, tranquilizer guns raised. The last photo captured Catherine's own Shadow as she intervened, stepping between the poachers and the horses. This is more than enough to prosecute, the investigator confirmed. Illegal poaching, trespassing on federal land, unauthorized mining exploration in a protected area. And if we can connect these events to Catherine Winter's death. Murder, Daniel finished grimly. The investigator nodded. We'll need Sophie's testimony about what Davis said to her in the canyon. All eyes turned to Sophie, who sat stroking Shadow's neck, drawing strength from the horse's presence. I'll tell them everything, she said firmly. For Mom. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed, driven by media attention and political pressure. Davis's arrest, a wealthy CEO caught poaching endangered wildlife in a national park, made headlines nationwide. When evidence emerged suggesting his involvement in Catherine's death, the story exploded. Sophie provided her testimony via recorded deposition, sparing her the trauma of facing Davis in court. Her clear, detailed account of his threats, combined with the photographic evidence and corroborating statements from other witnesses, left little room for doubt. 2 weeks after Sophie's rescue, Davis was indicted on multiple federal charges, including illegal poaching, environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and negligent homicide in Catherine's death. His company's stock plummeted as investors fled, and his board of directors voted unanimously to remove him. During this time, Sophie remained at the canyon, dividing her time between the comfortable accommodations now provided for her family and the outdoor shelter where Shadow continued to recover. The bond between girl and horse deepened with each passing day, even as both recognized their time together was drawing to a close. Dr. Bigay declared Shadow fully healed after 10 days. The wound has closed cleanly, she informed Sophie as they examined the horse together. He's ready to return to his herd whenever he chooses. Yet Shadow remained staying close to the camp, even when given complete freedom to roam. Each morning, Sophie would wake to find the horse waiting nearby as if keeping watch over her. "Why doesn't he leave?" she asked Jack, who visited daily to check on them. The old guide smiled knowingly. "He's waiting." "For what?" "For you to be ready," Jack replied simply. "The ghost dancer came to guide you through your darkest valley. Perhaps his journey isn't complete until yours is." Sophie considered this understanding dawning in her eyes. "I need to let Mom go," she whispered. "Not forget her, but accept that she's gone." Jack nodded. "And perhaps Shadow needs something from you as well." That evening, as the sun set over the canyon rim, casting long shadows across the ancient landscape, Sophie sat with her father and grandmother beside a small ceremonial fire that Jack had built. Shadow stood nearby, watching with those ancient knowing eyes. "I want to say goodbye to Mom properly," Sophie said. "Not just for me, but for all of us." Margaret reached for her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart." Daniel produced a small box containing items they had each selected: Sophie's drawing of Shadow, a page from Catherine's research journal, the wedding ring Daniel had kept on a chain around his neck since her disappearance, and a small photograph of the three generations of women, Margaret, Catherine, and Sophie, taken on Sophie's 9th birthday. One by one, they shared memories of Catherine, not with sadness, but with love and laughter, and sometimes tears. They spoke of her passion, her stubbornness, her boundless enthusiasm for the natural world. They acknowledged the pain of her absence, but also celebrated the legacy she had left behind. When they finished, Jack added a small bundle of sage to the fire, sending fragrant smoke spiraling upward into the darkening sky. "The old ones say that when we speak of the departed with love, our words become bridges between worlds," he said softly. "Catherine hears you tonight." Sophie approached Shadow, who had remained a respectful distance from the ceremony. The horse lowered its head to meet her, their eyes level. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered, pressing her forehead against Shadow's. "Thank you for helping me find my voice again. Mom sent you to guide me, and you did." She stepped back, her heart full of both sorrow and acceptance. "You can go home now. Your family needs you, just like mine needs me." Shadow remained still for a long moment, studying her with those intelligent eyes. Then, with gentle deliberation, the horse turned and walked a few paces away, looking back at Sophie one last time. Understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement that some connections transcend the physical world, existing in a place beyond words or explanation. Shadow reared up, silhouetted against the sunset in a moment of wild magnificence, then turned and galloped away into the gathering darkness, heading toward the hidden valley where its herd awaited. Sophie watched until the horse disappeared from view, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of grief this time, but of release and gratitude. Her father's arm encircled her shoulders, providing silent support. "He'll always be out there," Daniel said softly. "And in a way, so will she." Sophie nodded, leaning against her father. "I know." 1 year later, the Winters family returned to the Grand Canyon, not as broken survivors this time, but as purposeful visitors with a mission. Much had changed in those 12 months. Daniel had declined the offers to sell their family home, instead establishing the Catherine Winters Foundation for Wildlife Conservation. Using his geological expertise, he worked with the Park Service to identify and protect critical habitats for endangered species, particularly the wild mustangs of the canyon. Sophie had begun speaking again, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. She had also developed her mother's passion for photography, documenting wildlife with a natural talent that belied her young age. Her photos of the canyon's mustangs had been featured in national magazines, always credited to Sophie K. Winters, the middle initial, a tribute to her mother. Margaret had returned to her academic roots, but with a new focus. She was writing a comprehensive study of cross-species communication, combining indigenous wisdom with scientific research. Her work now explicitly acknowledged the validity of traditional knowledge alongside empirical evidence, a bridge between worlds that Catherine would have approved. Today, they stood together at the edge of the canyon, watching as park officials unveiled a bronze plaque mounted on a stone pedestal. The plaque read, "In memory of Catherine Winters, scientist, conservationist, protector." Her work safeguarded this land and its wild inhabitants for future generations. When we protect the voiceless, we speak with the voice of humanity at its best. Below the inscription was an etched image of a Mustang with its head raised proudly, a silhouette instantly recognizable to Sophie as Shadow. After the small ceremony concluded, Sophie asked for some time alone. She walked along the rim until she reached a secluded overlook, one that provided a view of the hidden valley in the distance. From her backpack, she removed her mother's camera, repaired now, and returned to working condition. She also carried a framed copy of her drawing of Shadow and a printed photograph of her mother. Carefully, she made her way down a narrow trail that led to the ancient cave with its petroglyphs, the sacred place where she had found her mother's camera a year ago. Inside, she placed the drawing and photograph against the wall, adding to the centuries of human connection recorded there. "I'm keeping your camera," she whispered into the stillness of the cave. "I hope that's okay. I'm trying to see the world the way you did, finding beauty and magic in the ordinary." The silence that answered her was peaceful rather than empty, resonant with memory and meaning. As Sophie emerged from the cave into the sunlight, a movement in the distance caught her eye. She raised the camera instinctively, peering through the viewfinder. There at the edge of the canyon wall stood a black horse, Shadow unmistakable even at this distance. The horse was not alone. Beside it stood a smaller black Mustang, now nearly grown, the yearling from the hidden Valley Shadow's offspring. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she pressed the shutter, capturing the moment. Through the lens, for the briefest instant, she thought she saw something else, a human figure mounted on Shadow's back, a woman with familiar features and a smile Sophie would know anywhere. She lowered the camera, slowly blinking. When she looked again with her naked eye, there was no rider, just the two horses, wild and free against the ancient stone. But Sophie wasn't troubled by the discrepancy. She understood now that some realities existed beyond the visible spectrum, in the realm of connection and memory and love that transcended ordinary perception. "I understand," she said softly. "You're both always here." Shadow reared up once, a salute across the distance, then turned away. The two horses disappeared into the landscape, blending with the shadows and light that gave the canyon its ever-changing character. Sophie made her way back up the trail to where her father and grandmother waited. They didn't ask what she had seen or done. They respected her private communion with the memories of this place. As they walked together toward their vehicle, Sophie felt a completeness that had been absent for so long. The grief remained a small stone carried in her heart, but it no longer defined her. She had found her voice again, not just the ability to speak, but the courage to stand for what mattered as her mother had done. T. 3 months later, Sophie stood in the early morning light at the edge of the newly established Catherine Winters Mustang Preserve. Daniel was now its director, having left his corporate career to continue his wife's work. The preserve encompassed the hidden valley and surrounding canyons, permanently protecting the land and its wild inhabitants from development or exploitation. Sophie raised her camera, focusing on the Mustang herd, grazing peacefully in the valley below. Through her lens, she spotted the black yearling, now nearly a young adult, strong and proud like its parent. A soft nickering behind her made Sophie turn. Shadow stood a few yards away, watching her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the canyon itself. "Hello, old friend," Sophie said softly, lowering her camera. The horse approached, no longer cautious around her, but moving with the natural dignity of a wild creature that chooses to connect. Sophie reached out slowly, placing her hand on Shadow's neck, where the bullet wound had healed, leaving a small scar to accompany the lightning-shaped mark on its hind leg. "I've been taking pictures of your family," she told the horse. "They're doing well. The preserve will keep them safe now." Shadow nickered softly, as if in approval. A movement at the far end of the valley caught Sophie's attention. She raised her camera again, zooming in to see a new addition to the herd, a black foal recently born with the same distinctive coloring as Shadow. "A new generation," Sophie whispered in wonder. She turned to share the discovery with Shadow, but the horse had already seen. Its ears pricked forward, its posture alert with interest. Sophie smiled, understanding flowing between them without words. "Life goes on," she said. "Mom would like that." Shadow pressed its muzzle against her cheek in a gentle gesture of affection, then turned toward the valley where its family waited. With one last look at Sophie, the horse galloped away, powerful and free, a living embodiment of the wild spirit of the canyon. Sophie watched it go, her heart full. She raised her camera one final time, capturing Shadow's return to the herd, not as a goodbye, but as a continuation of a story that had been unfolding in these canyons for centuries. As she lowered the camera, she whispered words meant not just for Shadow, but for the presence she still felt whenever she visited this place. "Hello, new friend. Tell me your story." The canyon answered with silence, but it was a silence full of meaning. The quiet voice of ancient stone and flowing water of wild creatures and enduring connections of memory and hope intertwined like the double helix of DNA that linked the generations. Sophie smiled and turned toward home, carrying her mother's camera and her own evolving legacy. Behind her, the Mustangs ran free across the protected valley, their hoofbeats echoing through the canyon like heartbeats in the living body of the land. And somewhere between the seen and unseen worlds, the spirit of the ghost dancer continued its eternal vigil, guiding lost souls home, a bridge between worlds that existed before human memory and would endure long after the current stories had faded into legend. In the vast silence of the canyon, these truths needed no words. They simply were eternal as the stone itself, flowing like water wild as the wind, and connected as surely as the bonds of love that transcend even death's formidable barrier. Sophie understood this now, and in understanding she had found not just her voice, but her place in the continuing story, a story that belonged to her mother and grandmother before her, and would belong to future generations long after she was gone. It was enough. It was everything. Some stories don't end when the final page turns. They continue to live inside us, changing how we see the world around us. Sophie Winters stepped into the canyon as a child trapped in silence, carrying grief too heavy for her young shoulders. She emerged with a voice that would speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The connection between a girl and a wild horse, between the living and what lies beyond, reminds us that the boundaries we create are more permeable than we imagine. Perhaps the most profound silences in our lives aren't empty at all, but filled with voices we've forgotten how to hear. In the ancient stones of the canyon, in the eyes of wild creatures, in the memories we carry of those we've lost, there are messages waiting for us. Not everyone will recognize them. Not everyone needs to. But for those who stand at the edge of their own personal canyons, afraid of the depth and darkness below, remember this. Sometimes it's only when we're truly lost that we can be found. Sometimes it's only in silence that we learn to truly listen. And sometimes the most important journeys we take aren't measured in miles, but in heartbeats. What calls to you from your own hidden valleys? What whispers to you in the quiet moments between thoughts? Listen carefully. The canyon is always calling.